Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Imagine you're 17 years old, driving through the streets of Ohio late at night with your boyfriend and one of your closest friends. Just moments later, your car is traveling at nearly 100 miles per hour before slamming straight into a brick building. The crash is so violent that two teenagers lose their lives instantly, while the driver somehow survives. At first, it seemed like another heartbreaking traffic accident, but as investigators began examining the evidence, the story took a shocking turn. According to prosecutors, this wasn't simply a reckless mistake behind the wheel. They claimed the crash was intentional, a deliberate act that turned a teenage relationship into a deadly crime scene. The defense strongly disagreed, arguing that it was nothing more than a tragic accident caused by reckless driving and emotional turmoil. So what really happened that night? Was this an unimaginable accident? Or was it a carefully calculated act of murder? In today's video, we're breaking down the Mackenzie Shirilla case step by step, from the moments leading up to the crash to the forensic evidence, the courtroom battle, and the verdict that divided public opinion across America. This is one of the most controversial true crime cases in recent years, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why. First, let's go back to the night when everything changed. It was the evening of the 31st of July, 2022, in Lakewood, Ohio. 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla was behind the wheel of her Toyota Camry. Riding with her were her 20-year-old boyfriend, Dominic Russo, and their friend, 19-year-old Davion Flanagan. Like countless other teenagers, the three had gone out for what seemed like an ordinary night. There was nothing to suggest that this drive would end in one of the most controversial criminal cases in recent American history. As they drove through the streets of Lakewood, no one around them could have imagined that, within just a few minutes, everything was about to change. The car continued moving through the city until, suddenly, it accelerated to an incredibly high speed. Moments later, it left the roadway and slammed directly into the brick wall of a commercial building. The impact was catastrophic. In an instant, what had started as a normal night out turned into a devastating tragedy. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan suffered fatal injuries and died at the scene. Mackenzie Shirilla, despite suffering severe injuries herself, survived the crash and was rushed to the hospital. At first, many believed it was simply another tragic high-speed accident. But as investigators arrived, examined the crash scene, and began collecting evidence, they started asking a very different question. Was this really a terrible accident? Or was there something far more disturbing behind what happened that night? Without warning, the drive took a horrifying turn. According to investigators, the Toyota Camry suddenly accelerated to an extremely high speed. Within seconds, it left the roadway and crashed head-on into the brick wall of a commercial building. The impact was devastating. The force of the collision was so powerful that the front of the vehicle was completely crushed, leaving almost no chance of survival for the passengers inside. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but the destruction they found was unlike a typical traffic accident. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan suffered catastrophic injuries. Despite the efforts of first responders, both young men were pronounced dead at the scene. Mackenzie Shirilla, who had been behind the wheel, survived the crash but was critically injured. She was immediately transported to a nearby hospital where doctors worked to stabilize her condition. For the families, the phone calls they received that morning were life-changing. In a matter of seconds, two young lives had been lost, and what had started as an ordinary night out had turned into an unimaginable tragedy. At first, investigators treated the crash like any other fatal traffic collision, but as the evidence began to emerge, it became clear that this case would raise questions far beyond reckless driving. The deeper detectives looked into what happened, the more they began to wonder whether this devastating crash was truly an accident or something far more deliberate. As the shock of the crash began to fade, investigators turned their attention to one critical question: what exactly had happened in the final moments before impact? At first, the scene looked like a devastating high-speed collision, but modern vehicles store a surprising amount of electronic data, and detectives knew that the car itself could reveal what human witnesses could not. Investigators downloaded information from the vehicle's event data recorder, often referred to as the car's black box. What they discovered would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. According to the data, the vehicle accelerated to nearly 100 miles per hour in the seconds leading up to the crash. Even more striking, investigators reported finding no evidence that the driver attempted to apply the brakes before impact. Instead of slowing down, the vehicle continued at extreme speed until the very last moment. Prosecutors also argued that the steering input indicated the vehicle was directed toward the building rather than drifting there by accident. To them, these details suggested that the collision was not caused by a mechanical failure or a last-second loss of control. Taken together, the speed, the absence of braking, and the steering data raised serious questions about what had really happened that night. For investigators, this was no longer just a fatal traffic accident. It was beginning to look like something far more deliberate. But proving that in a courtroom would require much more than crash data alone. Detectives now had to uncover what had happened before the three teenagers ever got into that car. As investigators gathered more evidence, the case took an unexpected turn. Authorities arrested Mackenzie Shirilla and charged her with multiple counts of murder, arguing that the deadly crash was not an accident, but an intentional act. It was an extraordinary decision, because fatal car crashes are rarely prosecuted as murder cases. According to prosecutors, the evidence pointed to a deliberate act. They argued that Mackenzie had intentionally driven the vehicle into the building, knowing the consequences. During the trial, prosecutors also presented evidence about the relationship between Mackenzie and Dominic Russo, suggesting there had been ongoing tensions between the couple before the crash. They argued that those relationship issues helped explain a possible motive, although motive itself was only one part of the overall case. The defense, however, presented a completely different version of events. Defense attorneys insisted that this was a heartbreaking tragedy, not a planned killing. They argued that there was no direct evidence proving Mackenzie intended to take anyone's life. Instead, they claimed the crash resulted from reckless driving, poor judgment, and emotional instability, rather than a deliberate decision to commit murder. The defense also pointed to Mackenzie's mental and emotional state, arguing that she had been struggling with emotional issues around the time of the crash. They maintained that, while her driving may have been dangerously reckless, recklessness alone should not be confused with an intent to kill. From the very beginning, both sides agreed on one fact: two young men had tragically lost their lives. But everything else became the subject of an intense courtroom battle. Was this a calculated act of murder, as prosecutors claimed? Or was it a devastating crash caused by reckless decisions and emotional turmoil, as the defense argued? The answer to that question would ultimately determine Mackenzie Shirilla's future and become the central issue of one of Ohio's most closely watched criminal trials. To understand why prosecutors believe the crash was intentional, it's important to look at what investigators uncovered about the events leading up to that night. At the time of the crash, Mackenzie Shirilla was just 17 years old, a teenager with no criminal record who, from the outside, appeared to be living a fairly ordinary life. But according to testimony presented in court, her relationship with Dominic Russo had become increasingly complicated. Witnesses described the couple's relationship as turbulent at times, saying they had experienced arguments and emotional ups and downs. Prosecutors argued that tensions between the two had been building before the crash, and evidence presented during the trial suggested they had argued in the hours leading up to the collision. To support their case, investigators relied on more than just opinions or speculation. They presented multiple forms of evidence, including data from the vehicle's event data recorder, cell phone records, surveillance footage, and witness testimony. The vehicle's electronic data became one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence. Investigators testified that the car rapidly accelerated to nearly 100 miles per hour just before the impact and showed no indication that the brakes were applied. Witness testimony also became an important part of the trial. Prosecutors argued that the vehicle appeared to accelerate as it approached the building rather than slowing down or attempting to avoid the collision. Combined with the electronic data, they claimed this supported their theory that the crash was intentional. The defense, however, challenged those conclusions, arguing that the same evidence could not conclusively prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. They maintained that while the crash was undeniably catastrophic, the evidence did not establish that Mackenzie deliberately set out to kill anyone. As the trial continued, both sides carefully examined every detail from the relationship between the teenagers to the digital evidence collected from the vehicle. Each piece of evidence would play a crucial role as the judge weighed one of the most difficult questions in the entire case. Was this a tragic accident or an intentional act of murder? As the trial moved forward, the courtroom became more than just a place to examine evidence. It became a place where two grieving families confronted the unimaginable loss of their sons. The parents of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan delivered emotional victim impact statements describing the pain of losing their children at such a young age. They spoke about the dreams their sons would never get to fulfill, the milestones they would never experience, and the permanent void their deaths had left in their families' lives. For them, no sentence could ever bring Dominic or Davion back, but they told the court they wanted accountability and justice for what had happened. Meanwhile, Mackenzie Shirilla stood trial in adult court despite being 17 years old at the time of the crash. Prosecutors pursued multiple murder charges, arguing that the evidence proved the collision had been intentional. The defense continued to maintain that the crash was a tragic accident rather than a planned act of murder, insisting that the prosecution had failed to prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. After hearing weeks of testimony, reviewing the electronic crash data, examining witness statements, and considering all of the evidence presented by both sides, the judge reached a decision. In August 2023, Mackenzie Shirilla was found guilty of murder and other related charges. A short time later, she was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The verdict immediately sparked nationwide debate. Some people believe the evidence clearly showed an intentional act, while others questioned whether a fatal car crash should have resulted in a murder conviction. Even today, the Mackenzie Shirilla case continues to be discussed because it raises difficult questions about intent, accountability, and how the justice system handles cases where the line between reckless behavior and intentional violence is fiercely contested. The Mackenzie Shirilla case quickly became one of the most talked about true crime stories in the United States, not just because of the fatal crash itself, but because of the difficult questions it raised. For many people, the case highlighted the emotional intensity that can exist in teenage relationships and how impulsive decisions can have irreversible consequences. Others viewed it as a reminder of the dangers of reckless driving and the responsibility that comes with getting behind the wheel. Public opinion, however, was deeply divided. Some believe the prosecution presented compelling evidence that the crash was intentional and agreed with the court's verdict. Others felt sympathy for Mackenzie, arguing that her age and emotional state should have been given greater weight. They questioned whether the evidence proved intent beyond a reasonable doubt or whether the tragedy was the result of extremely reckless behavior. These different perspectives sparked widespread debate across social media, television, and legal circles, making the case a topic of discussion long after the trial had ended. Ultimately, the court concluded that the evidence supported the prosecution's case, leading to Mackenzie Shirilla's conviction. However, the broader public conversation about the case continues, with many people still debating whether justice was served. Cases like this remind us that a single decision can change countless lives forever. They also show how difficult it can be for courts to determine intent when the consequences are so devastating. If you'd like us to cover more real-life crime cases or take a deeper look at the evidence and legal arguments in this case, let us know in the comments. We'll continue bringing you carefully researched true crime stories from across the United States. After hearing every piece of evidence, every courtroom argument, and every emotional testimony, one question still remains, a question that continues to divide public opinion even today. Was this truly an intentional act of murder? Or was it a horrifying mistake made by a teenager that ended in unimaginable tragedy? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Prosecutors believe the evidence proved that the crash was deliberate. They pointed to the vehicle's speed, the lack of braking, the steering input, and the events leading up to the collision. The judge ultimately agreed with that conclusion and found Mackenzie Shirilla guilty of murder. But not everyone sees the case the same way. Many people believe the verdict was justified because two innocent young men lost their lives, and they argue that the evidence was too significant to ignore. Others believe the case raises difficult legal and moral questions. They wonder whether a teenager's reckless actions, emotional state, and poor judgment should have resulted in a murder conviction rather than a different criminal charge. That debate continues to this day, making this one of the most controversial true crime cases in recent American history. At the center of this story are three young people whose lives changed forever in just a matter of seconds. Two families lost their sons, and another family watched their teenage daughter receive a life sentence. No matter which side of the debate people support, everyone agrees that the outcome was heartbreaking. Cases like this remind us that emotions, anger, and impulsive decisions can have consequences that last a lifetime. A single moment behind the wheel can change countless lives. That's why stories like this are so important to examine, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to understand how investigators reached their conclusions, how the justice system evaluated the evidence, and how one decision can impact so many people. Now, we'd like to hear from you. After watching this documentary and listening to both the prosecution's case and the defense's arguments, what is your opinion? Do you believe the evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the crash was intentional? Or do you think this was a devastating accident that should have been treated differently under the law? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read as many of your comments as possible, and respectful discussions help everyone see different perspectives on complex cases like this. If there's another true crime case you'd like us to investigate and cover in detail, let us know in the comments as well. Your suggestions often inspire future documentaries on this channel. And if you enjoyed this video and appreciate carefully researched true crime content based on real investigations and court proceedings, please take a moment to support the channel by leaving a like, subscribing if you haven't already, and turning on the notification bell. That way, you'll be the first to know whenever we upload a new documentary. Our goal is to bring you factual, detailed, and unbiased coverage of some of the most fascinating criminal cases from across the United States, explaining the evidence, the investigation, the courtroom proceedings, and the final verdict in a way that's easy to understand. Thank you so much for watching and for spending your time with us today. Your support allows us to continue creating in-depth true crime documentaries every week. Until next time, stay safe, look after yourself and the people you care about, and remember that sometimes a single decision can change lives forever. We'll see you in the next true crime documentary.